Joe Biden's recently revealed Treasury Secretary choice, Janet Yellen, has made more than $7.2 million in speaking fees from Wall Street and other large corporations in just the past 2 years.
Wow. Yeah. Here to discuss why this new financial disclosure might mean trouble for Yellen and the Biden administration in future confirmation hearings is friend of the show and journalist Zaid Jilani. Great to see you, Zaid.
Good to see you, Zaid.
Great to be here.
What do we know about these speaking fees, and what do you make of this?
Yeah, so Janet Yellen basically partook in a sort of long time Washington, D.C. tradition of basically using her position in government to rake in laborious speaking fees from firms, honestly, who she was tasked with regulating and will be tasked as regulating.
Right.
This is something I recall. I remember being at an event with Bill Clinton one time, and he said something like, "I used to be a poor fella when I entered government, but I'm not anymore," or something. He said something like that because, he wasn't actually poor, but he was maybe middle class when he became president. But after leaving the presidency, he made over $100 million, primarily from speaking fees before banks, U.S. corporations, but also some overseas and foreign corporations in other countries. So Janet Yellen, of course, did not make $100 million, but I think she made something like $7 million from speaking engagements before banks that were regulated by the federal government. Everything from PricewaterhouseCoopers, which of course is not a bank, but also UBS, which is a bank, and other like financial related firms, I guess I would say. And it's in one sense, it would be seen as, we're just going through a presidency that had very many unusual things with a president with a very atypical personality. This would be seen as maybe a return to the kind of influence peddling and soft, you can call it, it's not corruption because it's not illegal, right? Like this is, I guess what I'm trying to say is this has become a routine habit in Washington, D.C. for people who are in senior roles in government to go and either consult or do speaking fees, or in some ways offer their access and their influence to private firms who can pay a lot of money in between their stints in government. And I don't want to pick on Janet Yellen. I mean, we also had a disclosure for Anthony Blinken,
right,
who is going to be, I think, the sex state nominee. And Blinken has consulted in the past few years for Facebook, for Uber, I think for some finance sector places as well. He's not an expert in all these things, right? It's not like he was offering technical advice, right? What they were paying for was access. He's somebody who knows everybody in government. He's a friendly face who can be put forward to arrange meetings, to offer sensitive information about the government, about who they should talk to get their policy goals achieved. And this sort of thing has just become routine and so normal in the U.S. government that really the last president we had who didn't engage in this after leaving office was probably Jimmy Carter, who I think maybe did one or two speeches right when he left.
Yes.
He had some debts, or maybe he sold some land or something to a firm or a corporation. But after that, he really didn't do anything. He did make a lot of money, but he did that through selling books, right? And books aren't a particularly corrupt way to do it because it's just like consumers buying them for $20 a pop or something. And if they're good books, they deserve to sell. But this sort of softer influence peddling, unfortunately, has just become the norm in Washington, D.C. And it's very hard to shake it because it's not even seen as a scandal, particularly by the party who nominates people, right? If a Steve Mnuchin does it, Republicans are not going to raise any foul.
Yeah.
If a Janet Yellen does it, Democrats aren't going to say anything. So unfortunately, there isn't too much of a cop on the beat on this stuff. And a lot of people, particularly when they see their party doing it, they just think, well, they deserve to make some money too, right? So
yeah, what's funny, Zed, is you're absolutely right on all of those counts. Was actually the elite liberal reaction that I saw to the reporting of the story, basically calling out the Politico reporters themselves for even daring to report it. They're like, "How dare you attack a woman for daring to make money?" And people are like, "Listen, this isn't about a woman making money. This is about highlighting that the next Treasury or at least nominee for the Treasury Secretary of the United States, after serving as Fed chairman, is speaking and taking money from the banks that she was tasked with regulating." I think that's a pretty legitimate story. I mean, the Treasury Secretary is an immensely powerful individual in the United States. Calling this some sort of anti-feminist action as a job of just reporting a basic story just is so ridiculous. But frankly, it's just where we are right now for a lot of elite liberal discourse.
Well, what's interesting is I think when people offer these criticisms of government officials on both sides, really. I think there are Republicans who don't like when their officials do it. There's a minority of them probably who may protest it. Usually they're told something like, well, you're asking for a level of purity that is just way out there. You are taking a self-righteous posture, blah, blah, blah. What's really interesting is I think that the people who take this money and then argue it has no influence over their decision making, argue it has no influence over their future jobs. Everybody in DC is always thinking about their future job. I can tell you that from experience.
Yes.
I think those people are arguing that they're the most pure and they're most righteous because they're the only human beings in the history of our planet who don't think about their financial futures and what's in their bank account and their future opportunities, right? I think the people like me who will admit that if you have these kind of paydays in your future, that they do influence your thinking. I'm not saying it's a bribe. I'm not saying it's legalized corruption or anything that would just be quid pro quo, but I am saying it does weigh on you. I think we're taking the more realistic view because we're acknowledging that human beings are influenced by these things. I think the other side is that it doesn't matter at all. They're the ones taking the very idealistic view, is that you can make millions of dollars, which is much more than you make in the highest paid government official is the president of the United States, at $400,000 a year. If you're earning millions of dollars, doing nothing but making, hour speeches or doing some consulting work where maybe you set up a contact between some government officials and a company, that is going to influence your thinking at some level, right? At some level, you have to be thinking, if I go into government and I really crack down on these people and I make clear that I'm not available for this kind of access, I'm not going to be making that money. Right. And I'm not saying that everything Janet Yellen will be doing will be on behalf of UBS and PricewaterhouseCoopers, although I should note that UBS was famously given kid gloves by the Obama administration. So, that is something that should be noted. But I think that this is the sort of thing that we do need to be taking more seriously, particularly at a time when everyone's talking about the nature of democracy and how important democracy is. Democracy is not just having elections. Democracy is having a government that works on behalf of ordinary people and is responsive to their concerns. The more it's responsive to private interests, the more you're not talking about autocracy. There's no dictator, right? It's a very free country we live in, but it's closer to maybe you'd call it polyarchy, right? Which is that it's a selection of interest groups that are running the agenda and running policy, more so than the mass of the public or the general population. So
I think that's really well said. And finally, to your point about there's not a cop on the beat, I mean, kudos to Politico for actually reporting out this story.
Yeah, good.
Thank goodness, right? But, back when, and more questions have been raised about Tony Blinken, but David Dayen has been doing great reporting on Blinken and his past ties and what he was doing in the interim to make money and peddle influence, now coming into the Biden administration. And Aaron Rupar from Vox tweeted out, Blink participated in society, the horror. Like, it was out of bounds to even discuss any of this, or it's absurd that anyone would even care. So the journalists and the media are also just dismissive of this.
Yeah. Well, that's a real problem. And I think the people who are still digging on this, Ken Vogel at New York Times is still working very diligently on this, and some others are. I think they're going to get very heated pushback from people who felt like the job of reporters was to be a partisan, operative, right? They felt like, okay, Ken Vogel spent years reporting about Trump, about the Trump organization. We had great stories, I think, about conflicts of interest there. When Ken Vogel turns around and writes these stories, a lot of his readers are saying, what are you doing? You're supposed to be on our team. I mean, his job is not to be on a team, right? His constituency is supposed to be the American public and informing them about these things. And so I think Ken has been doing a really good job. As you noted, there's some reporters at Politico that are doing really good jobs. Ultimately, though, I think we need more independent-minded politicians, right, who will raise these sort of issues in a confirmation hearing, will make them a little bit of an embarrassment, will help change the norms around what the expectations are. I mean, the reality is that any senior government official gets a really sweet government pension anyway, right? Like, the president gets a great pension. 99% of workers in America are never going to get a pension like that, right? They can write books. They can make money that way. They can go teach at a university. They can probably be president of a university. Those are great jobs. There's no necessity for these officials to make money through consulting and through speeches to private corporations and foreign firms and other governments and countries. None of that is a necessity. None of that is necessary. it's only become that way because the norms have changed to allow it, to where we just expect our officials to go and do those things.
No, you're 100% right, Zed. I mean, and as you point out on that book, Obama made $65 million on his book deal. He didn't need to give a $200,000 speech. He just chose to give a $200,000 speech.
And what's funny is what you laid out, Zed, and what our belief is here would be treated as some like radical extremist view that public officials shouldn't cash into the tune of millions and millions of dollars based on their service. And yet, if you talk to the broader population, I bet you 80-90% would be in our camp. It's always great to have you break these things down, Zed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Next up, COVID vaccine rollout here in the U.S. has hit some snags. We're going to put that lightly, including some healthcare workers refusing to take it. We're going to discuss when Rising continues.